Mayor Hamilton and Rick, it's a great pleasure to be here. I've talked with both these individuals before, but it's a real honor and pleasure to be here kicking this off for the community. My role is something of providing some context and a little bit of doing an overture, because the real songs will be sung by the people who follow me, and I'm delighted for you that you'll have some of the nation's leading experts. In particular, I want to note Elise Cohn, who worked with me both on the National Broadband Plan as well as Gig.U, who we stole from Wall Street, and who has negotiated some of the very early deals where communities very similar to Bloomington were able to obtain next-generation networks. Aaron Deacon, who I've known since Kansas City became, in some sense, the kind of prototype of a gigabit community. And as I'll talk about, but he'll talk about more, the network is the beginning, it is not the end. And so it's really a question of what does the community do with that. Aaron, if not the nation's leading expert on that issue, is certainly one of the top. Joanne Hovis, who runs CTC Energy and is probably the leading consulting firm for communities like yours. She has done more deals than anyone else, and some of the, again, most important deals. I'll talk about a few of them later on, but knows this stuff better than anyone I know. And Lev Gonik from one community in Cleveland. I got to know Lev when I was doing the National Broadband Plan, and he became a co-conspirator with Gig.U. But one of the he was ahead of us, and he actually had in his community a kind of a gigabit prototype that we looked at the National Broadband Plan. Could not figure out how to have necessarily a recommendation about it, but wanted to imitate it and talk to lots of people about it, and it's really served as an inspiration, and so I know you'll learn a lot from his remarks. But I want to start by providing a little bit of context and start by asking the question, why are we here? And I want to make the point that we're not really here to talk about technology. We will talk about the technology and all the devices that all of us have in our pockets and all the different ways we connect with various folks. But really, there's an underlying idea here that's more important than the technology. And in some sense, it's what's the mission of public policy in the 21st century? And how does communications policy serve that purpose? A lot of people think communications policy is largely a federal issue. It actually isn't. When you think of, when we were thinking about the National Broadband Plan, really came down to four fundamental strategies: drive fiber deeper, use spectrum more effectively, get everybody on, and use the networks better for public purposes. In at least three of those, fiber, adoption, and public use, cities actually play a more important role. The federal government has resources cities don't have. But when we think about driving economic growth and social progress through those four strategies, cities really do it more. And at the heart of it is something that we should think of as high-performance knowledge exchange. And so what I'd like to start by doing, because this is an academic community, I feel a certain moral obligation. The mayor went back 150 years. I'm going to go back about 5,000 years, but I'll do it in about 50 seconds. But so that you can all get course credit, of course. We'll talk a little bit about the importance of knowledge exchange in today's economy by looking backwards a little bit. Then I'm going to come down to where are we in the United States with high-performance knowledge exchange, but particularly how the networks work and how we've moved from a gigabit desert to the game of gigs. And then I'll close by talking about Bloomington and some of the issues, really kind of setting off for the discussion that'll be done in better detail and following my comments. So let's start by talking about the role of high-performance exchange in our economy. So, you know, from the first century to about 1500, what was referred to as the Malthusian trap meant that population and economic growth couldn't really occur because everybody was fundamentally in the business of producing food. Food couldn't outrun population. But then something got us out of that trap and massively transformed the economy. Was referred to as the Industrial Revolution. There are many, many things one can say about the Industrial Revolution, but I think one of the most important is that the growth that occurred then really was a function of combinatorial innovation. What combinatorial innovation means is that lots of different people were contributing lots of different things. Indeed, if you look at the steam engine, one of the key elements of that time, it really involved hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different things. There's an historian, Stephen Johnson, who basically credits the Industrial Revolution to the coffee shops of London, in which I believe it started to arise in the 1500s when they started to import coffee. And he said there really were two elements to it. One was the fact that up until that time, the only safe drink was beer, and you actually don't get a lot of work done when you're drunk from about 10 o'clock in the morning on, and coffee is a kind of a different stimulant. But the other thing was that people were gathering and exchanging ideas, and it was in those coffee shops that a lot of the ideas that created the Industrial Revolution came forward. But that keeps growing, and it keeps getting even faster, and that's because we start to exchange information, and we have new inputs that drive this. So in the 1800s, we had access to new forms of power and transportation. In the 1900s, we had access to new forms of power and transportation. But what's really interesting about this century is what's driving the economic growth and what's driving the changes in the economy really all have to do with information exchange at the core. And you don't do it in the coffee shop. You do it constantly. You do it with this device in your pocket. You do it at your home. You do it at work. You do it when you're on the road. That's the fastest growing part of the economy. The fastest growing part of any economy is that which uses those new inputs. And as we'll talk about later, that is at the heart of what Bloomington is. At the heart of what Bloomington's economy both is and will be is this exchange of information from the professors to the students, but really in many, many other ways. And so the fundamental task of knowledge exchange in our century is we collect data, we analyze it, we revise courses of action, we have feedback, we keep doing this. And this is made possible by three really big technology trends. One is big data, big storage. We can now hold massive amounts of information in smaller and smaller computing centers. The computing revolution, we can take that data and actually manipulate it. This is sometimes called big data. It's sometimes called artificial intelligence. I'm not exactly sure I know what the difference between those things are, other than that big data tends to, the images of it are big rooms with big machines, and artificial intelligence are really like these cute little robot-y things. But other than that, it's fundamentally the same thing, very powerful computing power. And then, of course, there's the communications revolution. And that's, in some sense, we are talking about that today, but it's really linked to these other things. And the communications revolution is the ability to transition that information from one place to another at very high speeds. Massive amounts of information, not just being stored, not just being analyzed, but being transitioned. And I want to emphasize that this is not a Silicon Valley phenomenon. This is not just something that happens in the 11th Congressional District of California. I apologize, I'm from DC, so when we talk about a city, we were supposed to mention the congressional district it's in. But I know that fact mostly because the 11th Congressional District, which is Silicon Valley, is the happiest congressional district in the country. And the reason is fundamentally they're very optimistic. They think they can solve every problem. I think they're wrong, but it's really great. And if any of you travel out there, it's really fun to be out there. But it's not just about them, it's manufacturing, it's agriculture, it's construction, it's retail. It's every business is being transformed. And you see this in your daily lives, whether or not you shop at Amazon, whether or not if you are building a house and you compare it to how you built a house 20 years ago, or in any business that you're in, it is transformed by that high-performance knowledge exchange. And so to stay ahead in the economy, you have to have access to those kinds of things. And indeed, the great Peter Drucker, who was a management consultant and saw more of the trends more clearly than almost anybody, several decades ago, saw that knowledge work was going to be the essential work of this century, and that the productivity of knowledge work was the fundamental challenge. He also said something else that doesn't seem related, but is very related to this topic, which is that the danger of times of turbulence is not the turbulence, it's to act with yesterday's logic. And I think when we think about what we need to do, it's very important that we understand the logic we brought to these problems years ago. And while that may be useful, we have to have a somewhat different response. And so the way we built the telephone network, or the way we built the cable network, might not be the way we want to build the broadband network. That's a fundamental question. So that gets us to the question of, are we going to have what we need to take advantage of this information revolution? It doesn't take a genius. When Elise and I were working together on the National Broadband Plan, it did not take a genius to realize that the networks of today were not going to be sufficient for tomorrow. And indeed, several years after we did the plan, Pew did a study that talked about killer apps in the digital age, all kinds of things that are listed up on these slides, where you're going to need massive amounts of bandwidth, much more than you could get out of the current cable system, or you could get out of the current phone network. And remember, both the cable and the phone network were jerry-rigged to provide broadband. They were not designed for broadband. They were jerry-rigged for that purpose. And indeed, in that study, 86% of the experts said there'll be new and compelling technology applications that take advantage of significant increases in bandwidth. Well, that's nice and easy for them to say. But let's take a look at a map of how many gigabit cities there were in 2010. I might be wrong by 1 or 2, but I'm pretty sure that's the answer. There were none. It was a gigabit desert. That's where we were in the United States. So in the National Broadband Plan, what we did was we said, we've got to do better than that. We actually could not figure out a good way to do it. We had discussions with a bunch of people, including Google. But what we called for were a bunch of experiments and test beds. We actually had the wrong idea. One of the interesting things about the plan, and we did it very quickly, but we thought military bases would be a great place to do it for a lot of different reasons. Turns out the security issues there were exactly the wrong place, even though you had density and big uses and government funders. But in our discussions about this problem, we talked with Google, who came to me and said, we have a great idea for you. This was in December of 2010. 2009. Get Congress to give you $250 million, and then do like about 10 projects, and it'll be so great, everybody will want this, and then the market will change. And I said to them, fantastic idea. That is really great, brilliant. Here's the problem. Have you seen this Congress? Do you think they're going to give me $250 million? I don't think so. And if I got it, what would I do with it? I mean, how would I distribute it? Every town would want it. I mean, I just said, I'd like to do that. I just don't see how we do that. And they came back, and to their credit, they said, you're right, that's great. We'll do one. I said, now that's a really good idea. And that, Aaron is, in fact, the great beneficiary of the wonderful wisdom of Google to both do it and to pick Kansas City. But something really interesting happened that a lot of people aren't aware of. Google thought, when they came out, and this was about March of 2010 now, they thought they'd get somewhere between 10 and 50 cities to apply. Instead, 1,100 cities applied. This was fantastic. Now, what does that mean? What is the meaning of 1,100 communities applying for something where nobody can actually tell you, here's why you need it? Well, there are some people who just said, well, you know, it's a lark. But, and I think Mayor Hamilton would agree with this, cities do not have time to do a lark. If a city were to actually fill out that application, it is because they wanted something. And I thought it was a really interesting thing, and talking to a lot of these different cities, the thing about America, and I'm not going to get into presidential politics, but except to say that one of the candidates has certainly captured something, though I disagree with him on many things. People want America to be great, and they want America to lead. And they are sick and tired of reading about how Seoul, Korea has so much more bandwidth, or so much cheaper in Paris and stuff. You know, we're the country that people all around the world use phones with our operating system because we do great technology. And they use our applications because we do great technology. So they don't want to have second-class networks in their cities. And that's what I think was the meaning of that. And then there were a group of us kind of veterans of the plan who were really interested in this problem, and we said, it's great what Google is doing, but we should not rely on one company to do this. And besides, at that point in time, as far as we knew, they were only going to do one city. So we thought we'd accelerate it by getting together those communities that really had the best economics, the best demographics, the best pre-existing networks, place where innovation happens. That, of course, is university towns. We were really delighted. Bloomington joined us. We had a bunch of other from the Big Ten. I won't talk that much about Gig.U, except to say that about 25 of the 36 original communities are now well on their way to having accelerated next generation networks. And so this led to Google, actually wonderfully, is not just doing one, they're doing a number. AT&T is responding with a number. There's also a number of communities, whether you have one-offs, talk about a few of those later. And now the cable industry is responding as well, and this leads us to what I think of as the game of gigs. You can't really read it well because I don't know how to do good graphics, but first of all, you'll notice that those are fiber. Those are not swords. Those are actually fiber links up at the top. It's subtle, but the more subtle thing is it says you upgrade or you die. And we actually put out a report in the summer of 2014 where this was the cover page. And as we noted, it's not actually true, but we want it to be true. We want the phone companies and the cable companies and others to think if they don't exist, their existing networks, they will die. But the other thing that is true, or will be true, is just like the mayor was talking about with the railroad. If you didn't have a railroad, there's a wonderful little thing in, you go to Colorado and you go to Aspen, and it's a thriving, great, fantastic, nobody can afford a home there unless they live in the 11th District of California. But there's also a town called Ashcroft. It's only about 10 miles away. It's in the valley. It's a ghost town. And the roots of that, similar to what the mayor was talking about, was in the 1860s, I think. The railroad decided to go to Aspen, didn't go to Ashcroft. Ashcroft was actually more prosperous, but it didn't get the railroad, it died. I'm not saying cities have to have a gigabit tomorrow, but it will be eventually true. You will need better networks to survive. And this is really a great game. It's just really kind of started. One of the things that's interesting about it is every city where Google has announced that they're going, or a Gig.U community has managed to get someone to offer service, in 100% of those cities, the telephone company announced that they're doing it too. And now, in 100% of those communities, the cable company has announced they're doing it too. And what's interesting is 3 years ago, those companies were saying, nobody wants a gig, we're never going to do it, and it's way too expensive. They're now all saying they're going to do it. And so in a couple of years, you go to Atlanta, you go to Nashville, you go to Raleigh-Durham or Chapel Hill, you go to Charlotte, you go to some of these cities, you're going to have 3 choices for a gigabit at about $70 a month. But if you're not in one of those cities, you'll probably be paying order of magnitude 80, 90, 100 bucks for 50 megs. More expensive for a lesser product. Why is that? It's just competition. And the game of gigs is very much about how do you cause that competition to happen in your community. And speaking of your community, now we get to the third part, which is how does the city of Bloomington obtain affordable, abundant bandwidth, which ought to be the goal of every community, in my opinion, that wants to thrive in the 21st century information economy. And we start with a question that the mayor actually asked. We did not compare notes before we did this, but we did have a wonderful conversation a while ago in which this question came up. And the question is fundamentally, does the network you have now, is it good enough for 10 years from now? If it is, let's just start getting ready for March Madness, you know? I mean, there's no reason to do anything. But of course, the answer, which he's already given, and I think I've actually never been to a city that answered the question yes, but the answer is no, and it's no in pretty much every community. The thing is you have to start now. So let's keep going with how we do this. Well, the good news for you all is, and I already mentioned this in talking about Gig.U, you have very favorable economics. You have a demand for bandwidth, which is probably greater than the average community. You have a cost of deployment, which is probably less, not just because of the way the community is laid out, but because of pre-existing fiber that's serving certain big users in the community. And you also have the most clear case, and there'll be several discussions of this later, for the uses, whether it be the hospital or it be research facilities or cultural institutions. Those are often the big users. But it's not easy, and it's not easy because of some basic formulas. And thinking about the benefits of the networks, and this is just a classic economic problem, there are benefits of a network upgrade that go to the investor in the network, also go to the content and applications providers. One reason why Google's doing what they're doing is because they make money not just on offering a network service, they make money on better search and better YouTube, et cetera. Also equipment and devices, people will sell more devices, the local community, the region, the country, they all benefit. If Bloomington had a network, all of them benefit, but the only benefits that matter for the investment case are the benefits that go to the actual investor. And as to those, it's a simple cost versus benefits. And this is a non-sophisticated formula, but it's as much as, I was an American Studies major, this is as much math as I know how to do, so forgive me. But fundamentally, CapEx and OpEx plus risk are greater than the increased revenues, system benefits, and the threat of competitive losses. And so that's the reason we don't have an upgraded network today, because neither your incumbent phone company or cable company, the benefits don't outweigh the cost. It's just that simple. So if we break it down into those 6 things, and by the way, government policy dramatically affects 5 of those 6 things. It does not affect system benefits, but that much. You know, it's pretty simple. If you want to change the equation in which the direction of that arrow, first 3 factors have to go down, last 3 have to go up. But how do we do that? Well, I'm going to step aside and say that one of the things in thinking about it, again, I'm not going to get much into politics, but I've noticed in a lot of different places I've gone, there are always a couple of objections. One that comes from the left, which is, why don't we just, demand that this happened? Because the world doesn't work like that. And what my friends on the left forget is that if they want better competition or better adoption or these other things, someone has to allocate capital to that purpose. And, if a city chooses to do it, that's fine. I have no philosophical objection. But generally, there's a very significant role of a private investor. So you have to make that capital decision attractive. You cannot fight that math any more than you can fight gravity. What my friends on the right always say is, well, market forces will do this. The simple truth, and I've studied a lot of public policy and communications network, there has never been a communications network built in this country, or even upgraded, that was really done by virtue of just market forces. Every single build, every single upgrade came as a result of the government doing something that changed that. The AT&T network was really only built out once the government gave them a monopoly, universal service in exchange for allowing a monopoly. The cable systems were built, again, universal service for a monopoly. The satellite television stations were built when, really got built out when they had access to programming pursuant to something called the Program Access Rules of the '92 Cable Act. That was an essential input that increased their revenues, lowered their operating expenses. Same thing with the cellular networks. The government always plays a role in rights of way and spectrum and other kinds of things. And the 2 keys for the city to take advantage of the opportunity are really understanding how the city's practices affect those economics, and then organizing the city's assets, practices, and people to improve its ability to negotiate with third-party providers or most efficiently deploy their own network. I'm going to talk about understanding first. There are certain kinds of strategies, using existing assets more effectively, regulatory flexibility and efficiency, aggregating demand. Joanne, Elise, and others will talk much more about them. In the course of doing Gig.U, there are a number of different tactics that we use, that other people have used, that have the effect of changing the direction of 5 of those 6 arrows. And again, they'll be talking about that more later. The second thing is organizing the city essentially to this mission. And one of the curiosities, and I think a challenge for you, Mr. Mayor, is that nobody owns this in a city government. There are people in cities that may own traffic. There are people in cities that may own the water and sewer. but there's no one who goes to bed at night thinking about how do I get the city a better network. That's my primary job. And they wake up in the morning thinking about that. And when I was chief of staff at the FCC, one of the things my boss, the chairman, taught me was, if we have an important thing that we don't have someone who goes to bed at night thinking about it and waking up in the morning thinking about it, we're not going to win. And so, and it's a real challenge because this broadband cuts across enterprise uses, it cuts across housing regulation, it cuts across construction regulation. It's a very interesting challenge for the city. So I'm not going to read this. I'm just going to say that, there's an information role for the city, there's an engineering role, there's a legal role, there's a community role. There are a lot of questions that have to be addressed in the process of organizing. This event today is part of that process, and I congratulate you, Rick, for pulling it all together, and you, Mr. Mayor, for making sure it happened. But this is all part of a process that will make this come to pass. And again, others will be exploring that in more detail in the panels. There are key users, key elements to organize. There are key users. The university, obviously one. Medical centers, obviously one. There are key interests, real estate. Obviously, commercial real estate benefits tremendously when there's greater networks. I think everyone would understand that. But interestingly, it's also true for housing. In fact, the University of Colorado, there was a study done that showed those houses that have access to fiber are worth $5,000 more than those that aren't, just by virtue of that. And interestingly, the cost of getting fiber to these homes, order of magnitude, Joanne knows this better than me, let's just call it between $1,200 and $1,500. That's what it costs Verizon and Fios. And you would say, well, if the value of the house goes up, why isn't everyone putting fiber in? And the answer is pretty simple. The cost is to the phone company, the benefit is to the homeowner. And so part of the challenge is and this is not an unusual challenge, is in making sure that we get the economics and incentive right to do that. So here's the key question, and I apologize, I should have had your picture there, but it was pretty close likeness, don't you think? No, seriously, if you Google mayor and images, this is actually what comes up. So, and we all love The Simpsons. So anyway, the question is, what model should Bloomington use? There'll be a lot more discussion about this, but let me just say that from our experience with Gig.U, there were three different models. One is a facilitator. Elise, on behalf of Raleigh-Durham and Chapel Hill, as well as a few other North Carolina communities, did something called the North Carolina Next Generation Network. And they basically went out and asked a number of different providers, what do we need to do to get you to upgrade or build new networks? Google and AT&T are now in there, as are some others, actually. But it's fundamentally about facilitating private capital to come in through various different ways of thinking about regulation and flexibility and stuff like that. A second version, kind of on the other end of the scale, is primary, where the city says this is an essential government service. We need it for our community. No private person is going to come in, so we're going to do it ourselves. Chattanooga, which has a municipal electric company, did this. Lafayette in Louisiana did this. And then kind of in the middle, and this can go in a lot of different directions, and Joanne is actually the leading expert in all the different permutations, is partial, where the city plays certain roles more significant than facilitator, but is not the primary provider. And I want to focus on a couple things. One is, what are the trade-offs of these? Fundamentally, it's about risk versus control. The more control you want to have, and you laid out three principles, the more risk you might have to undertake. And there's a tension and trade-off between those. So I think the three you had was, you want everyone covered, you want the city to control, and you want it to be sustainable. Did I get that right? Well, those are absolutely the right places to start. But understand that when you actually study it, at some point, there'll be a trade-off between those. To be sustainable may mean you can't quite build everywhere. Or to build everywhere, might mean you have to give up some of the control. So, you want to start with the right vision, and I think you have the right vision, but then you want to see how the market responds. How do you get capital to be allocated? And that risk versus control is the most important. In this regard, I want to talk for a minute about something that you might have read about last week. The city of Huntsville has an electric utility. That utility was going out to build a fiber network, they decided, gee, while we're building it, we might as well put in some extra strands and allow somebody to offer a broadband service. And to cut to the chase, Google came in and said, we'll use your network. And this is very significant for a number of reasons. It's the biggest one being it's the first time that a major player, including Google, has come in and said, we're willing to offer the service without owning the network. And so there's a decoupling of network ownership from the service. This has lots of different implications. But what's really great about this model, which was actually developed by Joanne in the city of Westminster, Maryland, and a few other places, Huntsville's will be, but this is the first time Google's doing it, is it has the city fundamentally doing what it's very good at doing, which is civil engineering. Laying a fiber line is not that different than a sewer line, a water line. Cities know how to do that. And interestingly, Google has discovered, despite their brilliance, they don't really have much of a competitive advantage in doing that kind of thing. So they're essentially saying, city, you do what you're really good at. We'll do what we're good at. We'll put in the electronics. We'll buy the TV programming. We'll market. We'll do the customer service. We'll do the product development. Well, it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. But I think that that creates an opportunity. It's not an accident that Huntsville's a college town too. And indeed, actually, if you look at most of the towns where Google is now going, there's a lot of college towns in them. But it's a really interesting model that I'm quite certain will be, that you'll look at. It may not work because you have that situation of the electric utility there. But I think it's an important breakthrough, far more significant than I think most people realize. But again, it's not just about the networks. What we really want is a ubiquitous, diverse, constantly improving ecosystem between networks and devices and applications and users, where improvements in each one drive improvements in the other. Government policy doesn't really focus that much on devices, though interestingly, if you follow the FCC, they're now talking about set-top boxes and television. But fundamentally, again, it goes to the questions we were asking with the plan. How do we get networks to be better and to be everywhere? How do we get everybody on? How do we get applications to improve certain kind of public uses like education and healthcare? And on the adoption issue, which we'll talk about and Aaron knows an enormous amount about, I would just note there's a significant amount of private efforts underway. There will be a FCC decision at the end of this month, which will improve the so-called Lifetime program, which funds low-income people to get on, and we'll deal with that. There'll be a letter filed, I believe, at the FCC later today on that proceeding by a bunch of the providers and the community groups. This is an issue in which I think there's actually a great political consensus about what needs to be done, certainly at the national level. But at the local level, I just want to say there are lots of different kinds of organizations and the companies, all of whom we're starting to see kind of a competition at that end of the market, which is really great. The private sector can't do it alone, but if you have the private sector competing to do these things, you get market signals about what works much better than if you only have the government involved. So certainly urge you to take seriously what the others talk about there. That's an important piece of the puzzle. And as the mayor said, this is about everybody. But also, how do we use the networks better? A lot of implications for government, a lot of advantages of the digital platform in terms of transparency, always being on, always improving. And there's a really interesting thing. Equity is a big issue in the campaign. And I'm not, again, going to talk about the politics of it, but I would just note the following. Larry Ellison bought an island. Larry Ellison is the former CEO, the founder of Oracle. He's very, very wealthy. So he bought a Hawaiian island. I'm just guessing, looking around the room, if all of us were to put all of our bank accounts together, we probably couldn't buy a Hawaiian island. I'm not sure we could buy an island up Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan or something like that. Islands are really expensive. But here's the interesting thing. When Larry does this, he pulls out the same thing I just pulled out, and probably, if it's not exactly the same one that you have in your pockets, the one you have is actually just as good as this one. And you can probably now buy it 50% cheaper. And when Larry searches for something, he uses the same search engine all of us use. And when his grandkids need a little bit of help on a school course where maybe the teacher wasn't so good, they'll use the same Khan Academy refresher course that my kids used, our kids in Zimbabwe use, as long as they have access to a network. So we take advantage, we haven't done this well as a society yet, but the opportunity exists to make sure that that which is the best is actually available to all. That's the nature of this platform. And it changes government too, and I know the mayor knows this, that we need to upgrade how the technical help we have, but we also need to think differently about what government really does and how government really is a platform that enables a wide range of decision-making by various people. One of the people Elise and I worked with, the National Broadband Plan, after he left, went and helped build the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, the only federal government agency built in the broadband era. And they actually built it to be a broadband-based agency. And so when you have complaints or concerns, you go online, you fill out a little form. About 65% of the complaints, which used to all be handled by people, are handled much faster and are handled without a federal government bureaucrat actually doing anything. They bundle certain things together. The bank sees it. The bank knows that it has to deal with the problem. Maybe the problem was innocent. Maybe the problem was worse. But these things get handled. It's government as a platform of high-performance knowledge exchange as opposed to kind of government as a very heavy bureaucracy. So let me just close with a couple of thoughts, and then I'm happy for questions, or we can move to whatever you guys want to move to. The first is 3 insights I got from my experience with Gig.U. Everything that happened to your city 10 years from now will be enhanced or degraded depending on the quality of your networks. Simple point. You all understand that. Same was true of roads. The mayor talked about electricity, sewer, all the things that the people who built this town years ago did. And that would have been true then. By the way, the airport, 1939, airports are a really big thing. Atlanta was a railroad town, became an airport town. Those were obvious things then. The obvious thing for us now is you need networks. Here's the thing that's more subtle. Many things you are doing today or will do in the next few years will affect the quality of the networks you have 10 years from now. One of my biggest regrets about my first time at the FCC was we didn't put into the '96 Telecom Act a dig once provision. Okay, dig once is this idea. We mentioned it in the broadband plan. I think Obama's had like 6 executive orders on it. There have been 20 different pieces of legislation introduced with dig once. I think of it as dig once but announced 9,000 times. But it's a very simple concept. And if we had done that and we had had all the cities put in fiber, of course we weren't that smart to know that we should have done that, the problem now would be solved. And my point is, what you do today actually matters. These networks take a long time to build. As Aaron knows, Google announced Kansas City in the summer of 2011, and are they done yet with their network? Not quite. But they're getting there. But it's 5 years later. And that's the fastest moving company on the planet, okay? So these things take a long time. And the third point, which is also one that I think most people don't understand, broadband is bought as a community. Individuals think they make a choice, but those choices are heavily circumcised. Circumcised? Circumspect? I need an English major here. Circumscribed. By, right, circumscribed. Thank you for my Jewish friend, who I'm obviously thinking about something else. Circumscribed by the choices that the community makes. And that's a really important point. You cannot, even Larry Ellison cannot buy a gigabit unless that's available in the community. Actually, I wonder whether it's available on his island. But my point is, the choices that you, with the help of Rick and with the leadership of the mayor, are going to make, that's how you actually buy. A second thought. In the short term, it's pretty obvious. Cities that have cable versus fiber are going to go up, and cities that have cable versus copper are going to go down. And so the challenge is to make sure that Bloomington has abundant bandwidth. There's got to be a fiber. You need at least 2 providers who essentially have zero marginal cost for massive amounts of bandwidth. The technology in Moore's Law makes that possible. The reason we don't have it today is because of a lot of embedded market structure and incentives. And then finally, I'll just leave you with this question: what tools empower society to eliminate constraints on social progress and economic growth? Bandwidth today constrains those two things, so we can change that. But there are other things. Digital literacy constrains that. We need to change that. The way we operate governments, not the fault of the new mayor, obviously, but the way we operate governments, that constrains it. So all these things have to come together. That's what the rest of the day will be about. I thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions in the remaining couple of minutes if that's what you want to do.
Raise your hand and we'll get a card to you. The question that I have here for you, just to get things started, why would, you touched a little bit on this, but why would cities want to get into a business where there are incumbent providers?
Yeah, it's a great question. It comes up in every city, and it's a certainly appropriate question. Anytime a government gets into a business that the private sector is in, that question should be raised. I would say a few things about it. Number one, it's already in the business. The incumbents like to pretend, and they're friends of mine, and I've worked with various of them, but I also know enough history. They like to pretend they built they built these networks with just private capital. They built it with exclusive franchises, i.e. monopolies. They built it with access to rights of way. They built it with access to polls. They built it with other kinds of government benefits. So number one, the city is kind of already in it. Number two, this is a difficult thing. Just because they're private schools doesn't mean communities shouldn't be in the business of having educational facilities. I mean, after all, there was Harvard. Why should there be the University of Indiana? So the question is really what's right for your community. And you can have philosophical objections, and I have a lot of concerns about devoting a lot of risk capital. I will tell you, there are certain cities like Lafayette that use the primary model where they do everything. I think it's very difficult because cities don't have expertise in raising what is essentially risk capital, taking technology risk, taking marketing risk, bundling products, buying television programming, et cetera. But that city had no choice. The incumbents weren't doing the job, so they decided to do it, and I think it's working pretty well. But if I were in the city council, I'd be very, very skeptical of a city doing that. On the other hand, you look at the Huntsville deal, and what are they really doing? They're building the network for their own purposes anyway. They have enterprise uses. It's cheaper for the city to do it. The thing that Joanne, and I hope that you'll ask that question of Joanne again, because she's dealt with this question more than anyone in the country, is when you look at all the different things the city does, there's lots of good reasons why cities may want to be more aggressive in accelerating the deployment of a next generation network. It's not really competing, it's just facilitating lots of different activities that end up doing the same thing.
Do we have an additional questions? Sure.
Yes, sadly I do.
For the record, the question was, do you have any horror stories?
Yeah. Look, Gig.U, I thought about, I was an American Studies major, and one of the interesting things, of course, is if you study American history, you realize that we celebrate the victories, but there's that town in Roanoke, Virginia, where they all disappeared, right? Because I don't know why they died, but the point is Plymouth survived because of the Thanksgiving meal, I guess. But in any activity, when you start off with things, you make mistakes. Someone has to make the mistakes. Someone has to draw the map, and a lot of people who were making maps in the 1600s died. So we were involved in the project in Seattle. It didn't work because the small little company that was doing the work with Seattle, which had a lot of dark fiber, got ahead of their headlights, and they didn't have the capital that they thought they were going to have. And that project died. And the same company also failed to deliver in Chicago. So, one of the lessons we pulled from that is if you have a big established company they have a lot of incentives to make it work, even if they have a temporary setback. If you're dealing with a small company, and I like small companies, but if you're dealing with a small company and they get a setback, they may not be around for the next round. So that would be one. I would certainly ask some of the other the panelists. But this isn't easy. If it was easy, it would already be done. And so I think you have to, but the problem is if you try to get rid of all risk, you don't move forward. So in that sense, it's like any other kind of enterprise challenge. Making sure the trade-offs work, that's actually what the job, in my opinion, of the mayor and the council are. Are there acceptable, are you taking acceptable risks? And I think one of the interesting things about the Huntsville model, and again, it's a little bit unique because of the utility, is they've really reduced the risk to the city. But they've captured almost all the benefits, even though they don't have a 100% level of control. Yeah.
So I'm curious, is there maybe any thought given to cities getting together? So essentially approaching multiple partners and similar approaches to mitigate risk, essentially pool.
Yeah, it's a great question. The original idea of Gig.U actually was that we'd get all 36 communities and we'd have a single RFP, and we'd both reduce risk, but we'd also have the scale that we'd really accelerate this thing. Turned out the differences in state law were such that that was simply not practical. But the project Elise worked on in North Carolina involved a number of different cities that essentially said, we will standardize a number of things in the way we work so that you all can do this better, because none of the cities by themselves had the scale. So that was an example. In the state of Connecticut, the Gig.U effort actually led to about half the cities, or cities representing about half the population of the state, having a joint RFP, and they're now working with a potential vendor. I don't know, again, Joanne knows the actual math of this better than me, whether Bloomington by itself is sufficient. I suspect it is because of the unique density and character of college towns. But that's definitely a question worth asking, and that's another trade-off, scale versus speed of action. But if you're going to try to achieve scale with other communities, things better be standardized.
Blair, we have time for one last question, and that was, if it's taking about 5 years, in the example of the Kansas City, to build out a network such as this, what are the chances that the technology will be changed or obsolete by the time that happens?
It's also a very good question. There's a big debate. I do work on Wall Street on occasion when I need to fund my pro bono work, which is often. And one of the big debates on Wall Street is whether the cable industry, which has a lot of advantages in terms of both their existing speeds and their upgrade path, will prevail over the telephone companies, including the wireless companies, or whether the wireless companies in the next generation, in particular so-called 5G, are going to beat the cable companies. It's a great question, and it's a reason why one has to be a little bit nervous about any large capital expenditure, including companies like Google. Having said that, the truth is we think of a separate wireless and wired networks. They are actually very integrated at this point. The more fiber you have, the better spectrum you'll get, because you'll have a lot better Wi-Fi that comes off of it. And even when you make a phone call on your iPhone or your Android phone, it hits a tower and then it immediately goes onto a wire. Because of the way video is going, and we haven't really gotten two-way video at very high levels of resolution. I think the first really great application, and my wife's parents are both in their 90s, and I wish it was already here. It's not, but it'd be so much easier if they could talk to their doctor instead of going to the most dangerous place on earth for someone in their 90s. That would be a hospital, because people who go to hospitals tend to pick up diseases. It'd be so much easier if the doctor could see them. They can't do the same thing, but if they can cut down the number of visits by 50% or even by 20%, it's a big winner. It seems to me in that world, 5G is not going to work for a lot of different reasons. But that's a question I would urge you to consider in your own process. To me, as I watch Wall Street, those people, when you put skin in the game, you really care about the answer. Most people believe that there will always be a need for a wire, and the economics of delivery of massive amounts of bits over the wire are always going to be better. 5G is going to be great, but having the wires is always going to be necessary. With that, let me again thank you very much for inviting me. Please enjoy the rest of the day. You've got some great speakers, and it's great to see you. Thanks.